So welcome to another in a series of Idea Collider. I'm delighted to welcome the author Annie Duke, author of Thinking in Bets, which I'm going to say a couple of years ago was really one of my favorite books of the year, and probably needed this series to give me a chance to have an excuse to talk to Annie about it. So Annie, could you tell us a little bit about you and your reasons for writing the book?
Oh gosh. Okay. Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Um, so yeah, basically my background is that I started my adult life in cognitive psychology, doing PhD work at the University of Pennsylvania at a National Science Foundation fellowship. Um, I was really mainly studying learning, and I thought I was going to be a professor. That was the path that I was on. Toward the end of not toward the end, like at the end of graduate school, as I was going out onto the academic job market, um, I actually got sick. I'd been struggling with some health issues and got sick and found myself in a position where I had to delay going out onto the market until the next season. So I had to wait a year. And during that year, I honestly, I just kind of needed money, and I couldn't really do a full-time job because some days I didn't feel well still. And also didn't want to like start a whole new career because I was going to become a professor. So I needed to do
Right.
something like in the meantime. And my brother actually suggested I play poker in the meantime. My brother was already a really amazing poker player by then. So it wasn't that weird. It wasn't that out of the blue.
Yeah.
But this was actually back before poker was on television. So it was really, I really kind of think about the influence of luck on my life. And this is one of those points where um, I had what felt like bad luck, which is I got sick, and then my brother happened to play poker, so he recommended that I play poker because I couldn't see it being played on TV. I didn't know, I wouldn't have known otherwise it was a thing you could do for an actual living.
Yeah.
And I started playing poker, and what I tell people is the meantime turned into 18 years. So I played poker from let's see, about 94 to 2012 as a professional poker player. I won some things. I was lucky enough to win some stuff. I have a World Series of Poker bracelet, and I won the NBC National Heads Up Championship, and the tournament, a few things.
Yeah.
So I had a nice career. But in 2002, so this is overlapping because I didn't retire from poker till 2012. In 2002, again, happy accident. A friend of mine got asked by someone who we used to. So I had a friend, Eric Seidel, and he used to trade on the options on the floor in New York. And he knew somebody from there who was a good friend of his who um, had started a hedge fund and wanted a poker player to come and talk to his traders.
Okay.
So he asked my friend Eric to do it, and Eric just really he doesn't like public speaking. He doesn't consider himself to be good at it. It's something that he doesn't enjoy. So he actually recommended me instead to this friend of his named Roger. And Roger asked me to come and do it. And, I was like, okay, that sounds good. And it was kind of the first time that I really had this very explicit collision of what I was doing in graduate school with what I had been doing in poker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this really big question came up for me. And it's actually what I talked about at that first talk in 2002, which was when you're studying psychology, what you learn is that learning occurs when you have a lot of feedback tied closely in time to decisions and actions. So, you think about a rat in a Skinner box, right? Like you put a rat in a box, it presses a lever, it gets a food pellet, presses a lever, gets a food pellet, figures out that levers and food pellets are connected, and it learns that connection. So this is kind of like this is what you sort of learned as, there was kind of like this fundamental truth about learning. Um, but I'd been playing poker by that point for 8 years, and what I saw was that, like, if I were to design a human activity that was really, really a lot of decisions tied closely and tied time to decision, a lot of feedback rather tied closely in time to decisions and actions. I mean, this is a pretty closed, tight, fast feedback loop. The poker would be a pretty good example of one of those things. And yet, what I saw was that the people who were playing were pretty resistant to actually learning. And that's not to say that they don't learn some really big concepts right at the beginning.
Mm.
They know what the hand rankings are. They understand the mechanics of the betting. They learn you can bluff. Like that's a really important concept, right? I could win without the best hand. So there is learning going on, but what you'll see is in general is a plateau, and then you'll start to see people sort of play the same way,
Yeah.
even as they're getting feedback that maybe this isn't the best way to play. And I decided that's what my first talk was going to be about. Like, what is going on here? Why is it that they don't seem to be learning at the rate that the environment would suggest that maybe they should? What's true of the environment that's making that happen? What's true of the way that people are processing that environment that's making that happen? So that's what I gave my talk about in 2002. And in that moment, I was reminded of how much I loved teaching. So when I was in graduate school, obviously I was teaching classes, and I was reminded that this is something that really just makes me really happy, like just teaching.
Yeah.
So I started doing more of those talks through word of mouth. Roger recommended me to some people, and then so on and so forth. And I wasn't really marketing that I was sort of thinking in this space about how to think about the way that poker might inform decision science, and then conversely, how decision science might inform the way that you were thinking about poker, and how these things collide and talk to each other in this really interesting conversation they create. So I started giving a lot of talks on that. That developed into a consulting business. Um, and then in 2012, I retired from poker because I really wanted to write this book that was sort of the expression of the stuff that I had been thinking about at that point for a decade. Took me a couple years to actually get to writing the proposal and um, getting it to the publisher, and then a couple years after that to actually get it done. But it came out in 2018, and
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I'm pretty excited about it.
yeah, and such a great start to the book for me was, this is not a book about poker. You had me there, right? Because I've never played a hand of poker in my life,
Yeah.
and the concern for what seemed like an intriguing book was that it was going to be about poker.
Yes,
Um,
and I think you'll agree you do not have to have played
you don't have
literally
to
a hand of poker
understand,
whatsoever to
yeah,
understand. Yeah.
no, because I think you've made that very approachable. But I love the bit. Could you elaborate a little bit on the bit where you compare chess, which most people think about as strategic, and poker? Because you elaborate the reasons why poker is a more interesting model than chess really well in the book.
Yeah, it actually goes back to what I was talking about, which was, as I was thinking about why is it that in poker, it's like, you have all these decisions in the space of like 2 minutes, right? That, you bet and then someone does something back, and then or you can watch other people bet or other people raise or what other people are doing. And there's this constant feedback, right? Like, I bet and you raise me. Now I learned something, and that's happening within seconds. Why is it? Is it something about the way that the human brain is processing its experience, and is it the environment, or some collision of the two? Of course, it's the latter. So I started thinking about what's happening in this environment that's really different. And I think that the best way to explain it is to sort of show the difference between chess and poker, to kind of understand what's happening in that environment that really causes people to not learn particularly well, and then think about why is that such a good model for thinking about decision making in general. So the difference between chess and poker is this, that, and it's pretty simple. So I'll actually ask you the question. So let's say that there were two people who played a game of chess, but you literally did not watch a single move, like not one single move that was made in this chess game, but all you knew was the winner of the game. That's the
Right.
only thing you knew, but you didn't watch them play. Would you know something about who made the better decisions during that game of chess?
Oh, sorry, I got my dog's barking in the
No
background.
worries, no
Um,
worries.
yeah, well, I think, and that kind of program of mastery, right, tells you something about the person who won was better at the
Right,
game.
exactly. Okay, so now I'll ask you the same thing. Two people play poker for, I don't know, how long does a game of chess take? Like an hour, maybe 2 hours. They go play poker. The two people play, and you don't watch any of the game. You don't see any of the play. All you find out afterwards is that one person won more money than the other person. Do you know something about who made better decisions now?
From one game.
Yeah.
Well, having read the book, I think I have to say no, I don't, because of what I always imagined would be true here. And I know the debates about, is poker a game of skill or is it a game of luck, chance? But there is still an element of luck and chance in the outcome.
Right. So poker is absolutely a game of skill, but because of the influence of luck, it takes a longer time for that edge to realize in a meaningful way. Right. So you need 1,000 to 1,500 hours of somebody playing to actually be able to say if they won after that amount of time, they are a good decision maker. They're better than the people they're making the decisions against. So we can see this, that the reason why you can work backwards in chess from that one outcome is because you've removed a couple of sources of uncertainty. The first is a very strong influence of luck.
Hmm.
So nobody in chess is, you're not rolling the dice and you hit a 7 and you get an extra queen, or it's snake eyes and it's like checkmate, you know, what? So that's a really big factor. So what that means is that if I know that you won a game of chess against somebody else, that it wasn't due to a weird roll of the dice.
Hmm.
It has to be due to the way that you're moving those pieces around, right? That's the only way that the pieces can move. The second thing is that there isn't a strong influence of another source of uncertainty, which is imperfect information.
Right.
So in chess, I can see where the pieces sit for both of us. And what that means is that I can theoretically, with enough computing power, right, sort of create that decision tree all the way till the end. Because part of what makes a good chess player is I know that if I make this move, that here are all the things that you could do back to me.
Hmm.
And for any of those things that you could do back to me, I can explore what I could do back to you. And so on and so forth. We can iterate that game. And the better you are, the closer you can get to the end. And what that means is that you can essentially brute force the game, which, that's what Big Blue was doing. This, before you had AI and something like Deep Blue, trying to do it. But Big Blue back in the 90s was really just brute forcing the game. Now, poker is a very different beast. So in poker, there's obviously a really strong influence of luck. I have no control over the cards that are going to come. I can have a hand that's going to win 98% of the time, unless specifically, the Queen of Clubs hits. It's the only way I could lose. And Queen of Clubs is going to hit 2% of the time. So what am I going to do? Right. So sometimes I'm going to observe that. And in fact, I know how often I'm going to observe it. I'm going to observe it 2% of the time, except I don't know if I'm going to observe it on this iteration.
Yeah.
So that's this very strong influence of luck. And then you also obviously have this very strong influence of imperfect information. I don't know what your cards are. So I'm having to sort of guess across the possibilities. So that for me was the secret. Like that's what unlocked this problem for me of why is it that people aren't learning well? Because whenever you have an experience, you have to take that experience and kind of work backwards to what was the quality of the decision that led to that experience. Now, when there isn't a one-to-one correlation between the quality of the outcome and the quality of the experience, we get into trouble because it's very hard for us to work backwards. So in chess, if I lose a game, there's not really another explanation that I can go to.
Right.
I can't just say, like, oh, they got lucky. Like, oh, well, it was reasonable for me to think that their pawns were in this situation, but they were actually over there, but that's not my fault.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But when I'm playing poker, I can do all that stuff. So now what happens is that you see kind of two patterns emerge. One is that when I'm thinking about somebody who has nothing to do with me, that I'm not actually directly playing against, I do something called resulting, which is I say, oh, if they lost, they must be bad. If they won, they must be good.
Yeah.
Which is fine to do in chess. That's totally fine to do in chess. Not good to do in poker. It's going to teach you a lot of really bad lessons. But then what I thought was really interesting, that if I'm thinking about my own play, I do something really different, which is if I lost, it was because I was unlucky. And if I won, it's because I'm an amazing player.
Yeah.
And obviously, both of those things are mistakes because you can fill all four quadrants in the relationship between decision good, bad, outcome good, bad.
Yeah.
Once you have luck involved, right? Once you have imperfect information and luck involved. And what we do is, depending on the situation, we'll sort of selectively choose one of those boxes to kind of stick the reasoning in.
Yeah.
And then learning just goes awry. Then it's just a nightmare to try to figure out what's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah. And that idea of resulting and calling someone good or bad, despite all of the other things that have happened I mean, that happens in our industry all of the time, right? So someone would be called a good head of R&D if, one of their programs launches, a new drug this year, and they've done that 2 or 3 times out of the 50 or 100 programs that they might have, drawn that from. And someone would be called a bad head of R&D if, nothing hits this year, despite the price, despite all the reasons that might be true. So I think, we are prone to that bias in our industry.
Yeah, and obviously the thing is, it has really real effects on outcomes. So uh, it's really well known. It's a really well known phenomenon for capital allocators that they will uh, allocate. They'll increase their allocations to uh, they'll increase their allocations to funds that have performed really well in a year,
Mm,
and they'll decrease or stop allocating to funds that perform not as well in a particular year. And you can statistically show that they'd be much better not to do that, right? Because obviously there's regression to the mean. There's all sorts of just, you know, like the world is, stochastic. It's just like stochastic, rather. It's like there's just stuff that happens. And so, what generally happens is the one that sort of the people that outperform tend to go back, to the mean, and the people who underperform, assuming all things being equal. So so this really has it this problem has really big effects. And the reason why poker is such a great analogy for trying to figure out decision making is that these effects are in really tiny like it's in the littlest decision that you can imagine happening to you.
yeah,
There's,
yeah,
I used to say, like, so when I was growing up, the way that plumbing worked, there was a lot of luck in taking a shower, because if someone flushed a toilet somewhere in the house,
right.
it was not good. Let me tell you what. So I didn't have any control over the toilet flushing, right? Like if that happened, it just happened. So if you think about that, like a little thing that we think about is like completely like having no luck involved at all, like taking a shower, of course it does. Like at one time, if someone flushed a toilet, it was bad. Now, if I just step wrong,
Mm,
right? Or if someone leaves a piece of soap on the floor, or the hot water heater could break,
mm,
in the middle of my shower or whatever. Like there's all sorts of things that can happen. And we can certainly see this in terms of like driving to work, or the route that you take to work. If there weren't any luck involved or hidden information involved, nobody would ever be late to work.
mm, mm.
But of course people are late to work because stuff happens.
Yeah, and I think our industry is sort of stuck in what I've called the prediction paradigm, right? Which is this belief in the ability to predict everything to some degree of accuracy, um, ignoring the someone flushing the toilet problem in a clinical study, or in recruitment rates, or whatever. Um, so I was intrigued by your inclusion of the idea of decision quality in here, right? So what? 'Cause I don't think people necessarily frame decisions that way. That they have a quality, um, and that idea of thinking in bets clearly plays into that. So could you help everyone just by telling us a little bit more about what thinking in bets means, as the title of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the premise of the book, and I feel like this is somewhat non-controversial. I don't know. Maybe I live in my own world, but it's that every decision that you make is a bet. And why is it a bet? Well, so essentially what a bet is when you're making a choice about what option you're going to invest your resources in, that the option that you're choosing is going to create the best outcomes for you in the long run. So in other words, it's not, I can guarantee that if I choose option A, that the world will turn out in a particular way, because that's impossible. So if we think about sort of the structure of decision making, what you can think about is that at the foundation of every decision you make is your beliefs. So you have beliefs about the world that have big effects on the options that you choose. Like, as an example, um, it really matters. Like, what are your beliefs about hydroxychloroquine,
Right.
right? Because one outcome of that is that you could drink fish tank cleaner, right?
Right.
So, I mean, these things have really, like, your beliefs really matter in terms of informing your decisions. And because of imperfect information, obviously your beliefs are neither completely inaccurate or completely accurate. They're sitting somewhere in between,
Mm.
in terms of the things that you actually believe about the world. Because you used to believe stuff was true that you no longer believe is true. So we know that stuff that's living in your beliefs there's an accuracy sitting in there. We don't know exactly which beliefs are inaccurate in some way, but they're there. And then there's a lot of stuff we don't know, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff we just don't know that if we knew it, it would change what we think the right option is. So that's sitting at the foundation. So what your beliefs tell you is, here are what my goals are, here's what my values are, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and here are the options that I think that I have available to me in order to try to advance myself toward these goals. Here are the resources that I think that I could invest in those options. Now, so once you sort of thought about those, for any given option that you choose, there is not one future that can unfold when you choose that option. And that's true even for something really simple like taking a shower,
Mhm.
right? There's a future in which the water is hot, and there's a future in which the water is cold. And all you can do is say, some percentage of the time, I'm going to have a shower where the water's hot, and some percentage of the time, I'm going to have a shower where the water's cold. Um, and obviously, you can think about that for bigger things. Some percentage of the time, a drug is going to reduce the fatality rate by a lot. Sometimes it's going to have no effect. Sometimes it's going to increase the fatality rate. You can obviously get more granular in thinking about that. So you think about the futures that might unfold for any option that you choose, how much those different futures would advance you towards your goal or cause you to lose ground and retreat away from your goal. That would be the impact, right? The payoff. And then what you say is, okay, let me now look at all the options that I have to choose and figure out where am I going to invest my resources to get me the best payoff on average.
Mm.
But that's the important piece, is it's on average. As I look across all of these outcomes, which one on average is going to get me to the best place?
Right.
So that's why it's a bet, because we don't know for certain, and we can't know for certain for even the simplest decisions. And I've actually had someone say, but what about this? What if you're 2 feet away from a car in front of you and you slam your foot on the accelerator? That's a certain outcome. I said, of course it's not, because sometimes your car malfunctions, right?
Mhm.
Like, is it really improbable that your car is that going to happen? Like, almost never.
Yeah.
Of course, but it's in the possibilities, right? It's like it's there sitting in the possibilities. So no matter how much you think that something is guaranteed, it pretty much never is.
Yeah. And I think that idea, the linked idea of uncertainty as part of that decision making is so valid, right? I think that, because there's only two approaches. One is you try and narrow that to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yes.
We've done the predictions of, and there's this thing that I hate in our industry, the probability of technical success of a study, delivering against the thing that you set it out to do. And they're always like 75, 80%, which is unhelpful anyway. And it's
Yeah.
often that number because that keeps the program moving through the pipeline rather than killing it. But actually, it's ridiculous to arrive at a number like that anyway, because of the 1,000 things that could go right or wrong in a study. To then arrive at 73.5% seems nonsense, but it's done to try and pretend that you've reduced the uncertainty to, you know, 3 times out of 4 the study's going to work.
It's so funny. I just had a conversation with someone that was totally along that lines. I want to just latch on to a point that you just made, because I think it's so important. So I was talking about somebody about just a method, and I'm not gonna call the method out, but it's a method for, like, hiring job candidates. And one of the things in this method is that you think about the things that it is that you want from the candidate, and you only hire candidates that you're over 90% sure will satisfy that goal. And so someone was just talking to me client that I work with about whether, that they were sort of going through this. They were saying, this is the process that we want to use. And my response was, to your point, what? That's really setting you up to believe that you could be that certain about a job candidate. And I think that anybody who's ever hired people where they were like, really, they were just like the biggest, so high on a candidate and like, this person's going to be amazing and did it. And 6 months later, they're like, oh, right. And of course that's the case, because absent a time machine,
Mm.
which would allow you to look in the future and see what kind of fit that candidate was in your company, how could you ever be over 90% sure that this person was going to be some kind of superstar in the category that you're thinking about them in? And I think that just sort of like this idea that we sell to people that you could be that certain has all sorts of really bad effects. One is, I think it creates very poor decision making, because we think that that's the goal, and then we fool ourselves either into thinking that we've achieved that goal, or we go into analysis paralysis. And I feel like those are kind of the only two places that we can get. Either we're like, oh, of course I'm 90% sure, which is not, it's generally not going to be particularly good for your decision making. Or you say, I can feel like, I know I can feel it, that I'm not actually 90% sure, but I've been told that I'm supposed to be. So now I'm going to just go on this endless search for more information,
Right.
sort of still living in the illusion that you could get there. Like, you're still sort of buying into the premise
Yeah.
that you could actually get there. And then you just end up in this endless loop, because somewhere inside of you, you're not there yet. And then you can never decide. So both of they're different reactions, but in both cases, you're accepting the premise.
Mm. And it's an interesting point you made earlier about, 80 to 100 decisions, in rapid succession, where you're learning something from the play. And actually, you talk about learning by betting as well.
Yeah.
You're learning about the beliefs of the people that you're playing, about what hand they have. So the process of, we kind of talk about this as asymmetric learning. So how do you learn faster than the other guy? What the world's going to look like in the future.
So I love that you brought that up. So that's actually, so I have a new book coming out in September. It's called How to Decide. And I actually have a whole section on this concept, which I don't really I don't cover that concept so much in Thinking in Bets, but it's going to be in this new book in September. So one of the things that I started really thinking about after Thinking in Bets was, we have these two sources of uncertainty, right? These two things that are kind of disconnecting the outcome from the decision quality. One is luck, and one is this hidden information problem, this imperfect information problem. And what I started to realize was, oh, well, there's a really interesting difference between those two things, which is you can't do anything about luck. So once you've made a decision, that's now set what the possible outcomes are. So the easiest way to think about it, this is with a coin flip, right? The minute that coin leaves my hand and you yell heads, you know you're going to be right 50% of the time, but you have no control over where that's going to land. Now, obviously, the option you choose does change the set of possibilities and the probability that those are going to occur. But I'm talking about once you've made the decision, you don't have any control over luck. So what I realized in that sense, luck is kind of uninteresting.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to see it clearly.
Yeah.
You need to include it in your decision process, but you can't actually do anything about it. You can't, as much as people say you make your own luck, it's like, no, you make decisions that have different probabilities associated with some set of possibilities, but you don't actually make your own luck. So what I started focusing on was this information piece, right? And this is where I got really excited and started really digging into that and saying, but that's the thing that you do have control over, right? Some. So if I start to think about what are the ways in which not actively trying to discover the inaccuracies in the beliefs that I have, which is this little, I know so little about the world compared to what there is to be known. It's it's so sad if I allow inaccuracies to live in that little bit of stuff that I know. And how am I not going and discovering where those things might be inaccurate? And then the second thing is, how am I not grabbing as much information out of the universe of stuff that I don't know as I possibly can? Because that world has two things for me in it, that lives in it: One is the information that corrects the inaccuracies in the beliefs that I do hold. And two, a whole bunch of stuff that I've never encountered before. And it would be really good if I learned that and broadened my knowledge. And I started really thinking about that. So that brought up exactly what you just talked about, which is, okay, so what is one of the ways that I can really improve my knowledge? And it's to start thinking about, how can I start to do these really quick iterations where I'm just poking at the world all the time, which is really what you're doing in poker, exactly as you just said. Every time I bet, it helps me build a model of you,
Mm.
if I'm doing it appropriately. So
Yeah.
I make all these little tiny bets that actually don't have a huge impact on my stack in the moment, on the number of chips that I have in the moment. But when I get to see the way that you respond to that,
Yeah.
now it actually really helps me to build a model of you, so that when I do have to make a really huge decision down the road, the quality of that decision is going to be much better, because my model of you is going to be better for having done all these small pokes.
Yeah.
So you can really bring that into your own decision making in the way that you just talked about, right? Is that you can think about, if I have some decision that's going to be really big and hard to change and huge impact on the horizon, what are the little ways that I can extract knowledge from the world that aren't going to have a huge impact if they fail?
Right.
That are going to have but I'm going to find something out that's really going to not cause me to spend a lot of time going down a different direction, right? So what you're thinking about is, if it goes well or poorly, does it really have a huge impact right now? Am I going to lose a lot of chips to it, right? Am I going to kill somebody by testing this out on somebody? And if the answer to that is no, not really, then you actually want to do a lot of stuff where you're really not certain of the outcome, because all you know is that it's not going to have a huge impact either way, but it's going to help you learn something that's going to be really important for something later on.
Mm.
And it's actually a concept that I really explore pretty deeply in this new book, because I think it's incredibly important. It's the best, like, I mean, a simple example, it's like, I mean, you've got a lot of guitars behind your head, right? If you're thinking, like, I wonder if I'd really like to commit to playing an instrument. Like, you don't need to spend the time to figure all of that out in advance. Go take a lesson.
Yeah.
I'll try out guitar. I'll take a piano lesson. I'll see if this is something that kind of I like, and just do one of those things. That's really low impact. It doesn't take a lot of time, but you get so much information about doing that, instead of like trying to ask everybody's advice and, take months trying to decide whether you should take a guitar lesson or not.
Mm. Mm. Especially when that taking time is a dimension of the decision as
Well, it's a
well.
cost, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a resource, and
Yeah.
people don't. What I talk about in the book is this, is what I call the time accuracy trade-off, right? Is that, in general, it's not always true, but in general, the more time that you take on something, the more certainty you can gain. The less time you take on something, the less certainty you'll have. So there's a trade-off, which is you can either cost yourself some accuracy, or you cost yourself time.
Mm.
So the question is, when is it okay to cost yourself the accuracy?
Mm.
And it's when the consequences for not being as certain, the consequences for not getting it as close to whatever the objective truth is, are just super low,
Mm.
right? Like, it doesn't really matter.
Mm.
And if that's the case, then you should just do a lot of stuff.
Right. Yeah. And you talk, very early on in the book about, bets really being about, making decisions in the presence of uncertainty. And I really like the way that you kind of unpacked uncertainty as well, and the sort of dimensions and the psychology. As you step through this, what does uncertainty actually mean, and the biases that go with it. So, can you tell us maybe a little bit more about the uncertainty kind of concept?
Yeah. So, like I say, like the uncertainty is coming from two places. One is luck, um, and then the other is imperfect information. And what ends up happening is so that's the environment, right? I mean, if we go back to the beginning of the conversation where I said I was looking at players not really learning, and I was
Mm.
saying, well, what's true of the environment? And it's
Mm.
the uncertainty. The influence of uncertainty is what's creating an environment in which, despite the fact that there's a lot of feedback, you might not be able to sort of make heads or tails of it.
Mm.
But then the other is kind of what's happening in the human brain,
Right.
where you can think about what I think about with chess is that the environment itself is so constrained that many of the ways that our brains sort of distort things, distort our experience, just don't really have room to live in an environment that's so tightly constrained like chess. But once you create an environment where it is stochastic, right, where
Mm.
there just is a lot of chance, where there is just a lot of stuff that you don't know, like I just don't know what cards you're holding, the way that our human brain works starts to now have a lot of freedom to go sideways. And the way that I think about like so, obviously there's all sorts of talk about cognitive bias. There's, I mean, just a few of them. There's like overconfidence, which is I tend to think that I'm better at things than I actually am. Confirmation bias, which has to do with that, what we talked about, like how are you going out into that universe of stuff that you don't know and actually extracting really good information from there. The problem with confirmation bias is that we're very selective in the information we allow ourselves to collide with, and in the
Right.
sense that we want to collide with information that agrees with us.
Mhm.
Um, so you can kind of go through this whole list of cognitive biases, and what I feel like at the core of all of those is this very uh, like there's just this fundamental truth about human beings, which is that we are our beliefs, in the sense that if you were to think about what is my identity as a human being, I don't know how to think about it anyway, but it's the sum total of the things that I believe to be true about the world, that this is my identity, is my beliefs. So I think about any belief that you have is like a thread. And that is what the fabric that creates your identity is woven out of. So, fundamental to the human experience, I think, is that uh, since our identity is who we are, we do not want that to be torn asunder. Like we don't want there to be any tears in that.
Right.
Now, long term, like if I were to ask you from a rational standpoint, I think that you would say, of course, if you told me that something I believed was inaccurate, I understand that that inaccurate belief is now going to inform all the decisions that I make going forward.
Mhm.
And those decisions are going to be worse for the wear. So please tell me if my belief is accurate. So I think that, from that standpoint, as we're all sort of stepping back from it, I don't know anybody who wouldn't say, okay, I think that that's true. Please tell me that that fish tank cleaner isn't a good cure for coronavirus. Like,
Mm.
if I have that inaccurate belief, I want to know,
Mm.
because I might poison myself otherwise in the future. So I think everybody would endorse that idea. The problem is that in the moment when you're actually confronted with the corrective information, we process it as an attack on who we are, and it's just like we swat it away.
Mm.
So now that's how I think about when you talk about this uncertainty and why is the uncertainty wreaking so much havoc. It's that it's allowing this identity protection that we're always doing to really start to breathe, right? To really start to take up space in the way that we process the world. So if I go back to this thing about, when things go poorly, it's obviously because of bad luck. And when things go well, it's obviously because I'm a super genius. Well, we can see that that's an identity issue, right? If I lose a hand of poker, I can either say, well, I made bad decisions during that hand. Well, that's not very good for the way that I think about it. It's like bad for my self narrative. Or, well, I actually made great decisions, but it was due to bad luck. Like, which way to process that information is going to be better for me from an identity perspective? And obviously, same thing on the reverse. If I win a hand of poker, who wants to say that it was because I got lucky, right? Like, now I don't get to own that and sort of give myself a boost. So of course I want to do that. And this is true like of driving, right? Like if I get in a car accident, it's obviously the other driver's fault, you know? Uh, and in fact, the data shows that in single car accidents, 39% of the time people describe it as something else's fault, which is weird because you're like the only one around. Like the tree jumped in my way. I don't know. But everybody knows that, right? Like everybody knows, everybody has people in their lives, when bad things are happening, it's always somebody's doing something to them. And when good things are happening, they're always a super genius,
Yeah.
right? Like I did badly on the test. It's because the teacher had really hard questions that, they didn't teach us during the lectures. But when you do well on a test, it's because you're really smart and you studied really hard. I mean, this is so incredibly pervasive.
Mm.
And I feel like if you look sort of across the biases, they all kind of like, I feel like you can all pull them back to this issue.
Mm.
So like overconfidence, right? Well, obviously I want to feel good about myself. Like, I don't want to say like I'm average. Who wants to do that? Like, that doesn't feel like good. You know what I mean? So I feel like a lot of them kind of tie back to this identity protection,
Yeah.
and that can only live in an environment that has a significant amount of uncertainty, because without the uncertainty, you're too constrained in your ability to go to those kinds of explanations.
Right. And it's something that's incredibly pervasive within, well, I guess, companies instead of individuals, right? Because, as you say, the kind of set of beliefs that get you someplace in a company are typically not, I don't know, or I'm uncertain, or let's lean into that. It's I'm the smartest guy in the room. I'm going to make the decision. And then everything's going to be a confrontation to that, to that set of beliefs.
Yeah, and what I wish is that I wish that people could really understand that those things can live together.
Hmm.
That you can really project a lot of confidence in your decision making ability
Mm.
while also really representing uncertainty in a way that's closer to ground truth, that's closer to how much uncertainty there actually is. So
Yeah.
it's the difference between just saying, um, well, I'm 100% sure that this is the way we should go, and I know it from past experience, and my gut is telling me so, and we're going full force down this road, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
Versus saying, well, we've really explored all of the options, and as we look at it, uh, option A has a 63% chance of success, and option B has a 42% chance of success. So clearly,
Mm.
option A is the way that we should go. And we've gone through a very thoughtful process to come up with these probabilities. And so therefore, it's very clear, and I'm very confident that option A is the choice. And you've projected the same thing, right? Like, you've projected that, yeah, like, I'm a good decision maker and I know how to do this stuff, and I'm an expert,
Mm.
and I'm thoughtful, and I've thought this through, and I really can think about how things might unfold in the future. But you've also allowed the uncertainty to breathe when you do that.
Mm.
And I think, as with many things, people don't understand that those two things can live in the same space, at least not intuitively.
Yeah. And a great part of the book is your trajectory when you started, truth seeking, right? That idea that, I might be wrong, or I want to get better at this, trusting in the process of making decisions. You tell us a little bit more about, how you describe truth seeking, and the kind of, the presence of diversity of opinion in the mix.
Yeah, so this is another concept that really gets explored much more deeply, um, in the next book. But obviously, I talk about it quite a bit in Thinking in Bats. So again, like, if we're thinking about this thing that you can do something about, which is imperfect information,
Mm.
we think about the fact that, like, the stuff like, fits on the head of a pin, and the stuff you don't know is like the size of the universe. You have to start like shining of light into that universe of stuff that you don't know. And the problem for most of us is that, as I said, we're not interacting with that in a way that actually exposes us to that information that disagrees with us, that is corrective.
Mm.
And not only that, when we do come across it, we tend to be very, very good at dismissing it.
Mhm.
Um, so and I'm sure you experience this in your industry, that you know when somebody has a prior belief about efficacy, they're finding all sorts of studies that support their prior, in
Yeah.
terms of what they believe about efficacy. And if they come up, and then if they see a study, and that this work has actually been done, they've shown that this does happen. um, if you're shown a study that disagrees with what your prior is, you pick apart the methodology, and you hold that methodology whether it's like, how did you recruit the subjects? You know, what exactly was the structure? Was it double blind? Was it, so on and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of methodological arguments that you can make really against any study that's done. And so what's happening is that when it proves your prior, you're like, cool. And you're not holding the things that you could use to sort of reject or to uh, loosen your confidence in the result to the same standard that you are when it disagrees with you, right? So we can see that, and that, so in both you might say like, oh no, I read a study that disagreed with me, but what you don't realize is that you've held it to a different standard.
Mhm.
So the issue is that the only way that we can improve our knowledge is to make sure that we're allowing dispersion of opinion, cognitive dispersion, to be breathing in the environment that we're living, whether it's on a team that you work with, whether it's just in terms of the people that you're interacting with on a daily basis, whether it's in terms of the media that you're interacting with.
Mm.
If you don't find a way to access the dispersion of opinion, you really can't find the truth.
Yeah.
And we're just so bad at it. So what you have to do is start to, first of all, get a mindset change. And the mindset change basically is, uh, I want to get better at decision making. And I want to think about the horror that I would feel if I found out 10 years that I had made 10 years worth of decisions informed by an incorrect belief. That
Right.
would be pretty horrifying to me. So I would really like to find out when I'm wrong. And so I'm going to start creating an environment within which I am operating that is going to celebrate dispersion of opinion, that's going to get really excited when you uncover the fact that people are on different sides of an opinion,
Mm.
that people have data that you haven't seen, that people have a different perspective on the exact same data that you're both looking at, that, and then now you can have a really productive conversation about that, that's going to get you closer to ground truth. But you have to be very open-minded to that information. So that's the first thing, is you have to have the mindset change. The second thing is that now you have to start operating within, the environment that you're operating in a way that maximizes your ability to spot the dispersion.
Right.
And I think that one of the big problems that we have is that the way that we naturally interact with each other in human beings is actually to reduce the dispersion, not to expose it.
Mhm.
A super simple example of this is, like, let's say that I were to share like an op-ed with you, like some sort of political article. um, Generally the way that people do that is, hey, I read this piece, I really think that there's a lot of bias in this piece. I'm really concerned because they weren't taking into account this other data that I know about, and I think that the way they were spinning this was really cherry picking. And so I give you like a pretty good dissertation on it, and then I send it to you, and I now say this thing. I'd really like to know what you think. Well, I've already told you everything that I think.
Yeah.
So the chances that I'm actually going to get your true opinion on the article, if I hadn't given you all of my opinion first, is now, well, almost zero.
Mm.
And if I really want to know what you think, what I should be doing is sending you the article and say, hey, could you take a read of this? I'd love your thoughts. Period. Like
Mm.
literally, period. Now, nobody ever does this.
Mhm.
So on an individual level, you can just kind of take this idea. If you really want to start living this truth seeking, which is really just living this open mindedness and ability, and willingness to collide
Mm.
with information that disagrees with you. Like that's really what it means.
Mm.
Because what you want to know is ground truth. You don't want to know the thing that you don't want to just affirm your worldview. Then the first principle is this: the only way that you can know that you're disagreeing with me is if I tell you what I think first.
Right.
So if I want Mike's opinion, I need to not tell him Annie's opinion. And that's a first step. So then you can there are ways that you can start to instantiate this in a team environment where obviously it doesn't matter if I say to you, what do you think? Because as soon as you've opened your mouth, you've ruined it for everybody else, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, but there are lots of ways that you can instantiate this in a team setting. I go through those in my book, but it's that first principle, right? Like, just we know that human beings do not like to disagree with each other. They just don't. That feeling of team, people falsely think means agreement. That when people are interacting with the teams, it's always to get to agreement,
Hmm.
right? Which is really different than getting to a decision, right? You don't have to agree to actually get to a decision. But people think that it's about convincing other people. Like we all have to convince each other so that we can all act as one, and then that will make us a team. When actually that's quite bad for decision making. So just that first principle is like, don't let people know what you think.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to get into a couple of things, but I'm just watching the clock as well. We did a pre-mortem once with a pharmaceutical client, and it was fascinating. And that team, when they went through that exercise, were able to come up with 100 things, 100 reasons that something was going to fail. They'd never been asked before. They'd never been given the permission to describe what was going to go wrong. And we went back about 3 years later when actually the thing had failed, and we asked what had happened differently as a result of it. Nothing had happened differently because people didn't want to hear it, right? They didn't want to hear. So I'd
Yeah,
love
so
to
I
get.
so actually I love that. So this is something again, like I talk about in thinking bets, I really, really get deep into this idea of like pre-mortems and why it's really important to think negatively, not in the sense of like believing you're going to fail, but really exploring the ways that you might fail.
Right.
It, and the reason is that it goes back to sort of something we were talking about before, which is your job as a decision maker is not to figure out the particular future that's going to occur, right? It's to get as broad a view of the different ways that the future might unfold, and
Right.
then start thinking about what are the decisions that can work for me under those different futures that might unfold so that I can be prepared for them.
Mhm.
Sometimes you can change your decision to change to change that set of outcomes or the probability of those outcomes. Other times you actually don't want to change your decision because the chance of failure in this particular case might be tolerable given the upside. If it succeeds, that's fine. But then what you can do is you can say, are there ways that we can hedge against those failures? So there are decisions that we can make that will soften the blow
Yeah.
of those failures occurring. If those failures occur, we can put an action plan in place in advance so that we're not just reacting, going, "Whoa, why did we fail?" We can say, "Well, we kind of knew this was going to happen, and we've got our reaction in place, and we know exactly what we're going to do in response to that." So, like one of the simplest instantiations of that would be like an A/B test, right? Or right now, actually, in the world, there's like 110 different vaccines being
Yeah.
tested.
Yeah.
That's a very good example of recognizing that there's a big chance of failure for any single one of them. And so, what you want to do is do all of these things in parallel and not do them sequentially, waiting for each one to fail because the chance of failure is very high.
Right.
But you're willing to tolerate that for any individual vaccine that you might be testing because obviously the impact, if it works, is so great. But given that, let's just let's try to test it. Let's try as many of them as we possibly can to increase our probability of success. Like that's a good example of living in uncertainty.
Yeah.
And what I think right now is that what's happened with coronavirus is that people are, when we were talking before about one reaction to uncertainty is to pretend it doesn't exist. I think that's very hard to do when coronavirus is just running around the world, because we recognize like the information landscape is obviously changing very rapidly. It's shifting. There's going to be a lot of luck involved. And so I think that this idea of like, well, let's test 110 different vaccines at once makes more sense in this environment. And the more that people can understand that that makes sense literally in every environment that you're ever making decisions in, and you can do those in smaller ways for pretty much any decision that you're thinking about, I think the better off that people would be in terms of their decision making. And then when you did a pre-mortem, you would actually do something with it,
Right.
right? As opposed to, I think that the way that people think about pre-mortems is, I'm going to do the pre-mortem and then I'm just going to decide whether I'm going to make this decision or not.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, okay, now I did the pre-mortem, I found out a whole bunch of different ways that failure might occur. Let me actually think about how I can make some decisions that would help with those things,
Mm.
even though I'm still going to go ahead with this option. Right. Like, I mean, do you understand? Like, it's,
Yeah. No, I mean, fixing some of the infrastructure around it would have, in this case, made a very big difference to
right.
to the probability of success. Um, there are 100 other things I wanted to cover. I love that little acronym kudos in the book, and I'm going to have to put it in the notes, because as a way for a team to approach, organizing or.
Yeah, so yeah, I can describe it just really fast. Like basically, when you're thinking about this idea of truth seeking and kind of what are the principles of it, like that are going to cause you to collide with this corrective information, right? The first is just you got to share the information.
Right.
So because we'd like to protect our identity, if I'm asking for your opinion about something and I know the thing that I would like to be true, I will tend to highlight or give you data that supports
Hmm.
the opinion and not give you data that doesn't support the opinion.
Right.
Kind of in the same sense of like, well, I've looked at this study that doesn't confirm my prior, but I've seen that the methodology is so horrible that I don't really need to show it to Mike.
Mm.
Right. Like, I mean, and we do this and again, like not on purpose. It's not, I'm not trying to manipulate you.
Mm.
I just want the things that I believe to be true. And I don't even realize that I'm doing this stuff. So the C in kudos has to do with communism, not in the political sense, but in the sense that all of the data needs to be shared. You need to have all the information to help me with my decision.
Yep.
The U is universalism. It's just, it doesn't matter if it's your mom or Mussolini who says the earth is round, it's just round.
Yep.
Right? It's like Copernicus could say it, your mom, whatever, it's round.
Yep.
So we need to sort of try to separate the deliverer of the information from the information itself. The D is disinterestedness, which obviously in your industry, you need to think about it as financial
Mm.
conflicts of interest. But there's this other thing, and that goes back to this problem of identity that I talked about, that we all have a conflict of interest, which is we want to support the beliefs that we already have.
Mm.
And what we want to do is try to get away from that and start to think about what's true of the world independent of the things that I believe to be true of the world. That's hard to instantiate, but you can do it with the right systems. That will be in the next book.
Mm.
People can read in September. And then the last piece is objective skepticism, which is what we just covered,
Yep.
right? How do you start to think about your own beliefs, about your own decisions, about the options that you have under consideration in a skeptical way? Not thinking like, and I think that people get confused. It's not that I don't believe I'm going to succeed. It's not that
Mm.
I don't set positive goals for myself. Of
Mm.
course, I do all of those things. I don't think I'm going to fail.
Mm.
Like I'm not, I don't believe that I'm going to fail at things that I do.
Yep.
It's that what I recognize, and I guess it's sort of a paradox, is that the more that I explore the ways in which I might fail,
Mm.
the less likely I am to do so, that will actually create success for myself, because it allows me to look at the things that I'm thinking and the things that I believe and what my priors are and my assumptions and so on, and what I believe to be true about the world and all of this stuff in a more skeptical way
Mm.
that then really improves the quality of the information that's then going to be informing my decisions. The better the quality of the information that informs my decisions, the better my decisions are going to be, the better on average my outcomes are going to be, and it's going to put me on an upward trajectory. I think that people confuse those two things. They
Mm.
think, well, I don't want to imagine failure because, first of all, ooh, it feels bad. It feels like I'm failing, and that's an attack on my identity. But also, it gets into this magical thinking that if I imagine the ways that I might fail, that it will actually create that failure.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you say this kind of confusion between skepticism and cynicism. I think that
Right. Yeah.
they often get put together. Right? So, um, I wish this was another 2 or 3 hours long. Uh, I always ask before signing off: is there a book that you would recommend to everyone to keep the kind of book club chain going?
Oh my gosh, there's so many.
Yeah, if you were to pick
Um, there's so many great books. I would really recommend Super Forecasters. I
Mhm.
don't know if you've read that yet.
The Tetlock book, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's by Phil Tetlock. It's really about how are you really getting comfortable with thinking about probabilistic futures and how do you get better at allowing yourself to hold many sort of possibilities in your head at once.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good one. There's a great book that just came out called Perfectly Confident,
Okay.
which is by a guy named Don Moore. And it's really about all the different ways in which our confidence is poorly calibrated.
Mhm.
And how do you actually get better calibrated in terms of your confidence in the things that you believe to be true? I think that's an excellent one. Um, obviously Thinking Fast and Slow, which I'm sure you've read, which is just like the encyclopedia of like, oh, all
Mm,
these ways that we have no idea what we're thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's an amazing one. There's so many good books. Oh
I
my
know.
gosh. Michael Malleson, The Success Equation,
Okay.
is an incredible book about luck and skill.
Mhm.
And it's really like when people ask me, like, can you talk about luck and skill and the interaction between the two? I say I can, but I can't say it better than it's already said in The Success Equation. So you should really go read that book,
Okay.
because that really talks about like where sort of human activities sit on the spectrum between the influence in the short run of luck versus skill, how much influence in the long run there is of those two things. How do you make decisions in those environments? How is that expressing? Such a good book. So definitely go read that. And then the only other thing I would say is there's a book that's going to be coming out in a second here called The Biggest Bluff by Maria Konnikova, a New Yorker writer who has a PhD in psychology and ended up working with Eric Seidel, who I told you about, to play poker, to try to explore the influence of luck and to really kind of understand game theory. And it's this beautiful melding of like a memoir with an amazing lesson in like game theory and luck and
Oh,
skill and randomness and chance and uncertainty. And she ended up actually becoming quite good at poker. And she was a writer for a New Yorker. So unlike me, she writes really beautifully. So it's like this really poetic, it's so much like the prose is so much better than anything I could write. That's actually coming out next week.
oh wow. Okay.
I'd really recommend that one as well. So I don't know. There's so many books. There's so many books.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much. And I knew this would be enjoyable. I didn't realize quite how enjoyable it's been. So thank you so much for the time.
Well, hopefully I can come back when the new one comes out
Yeah,
and
well, let's make
do
a
it
date
again.
to do that. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. One thing I was keen to explore a little bit like with David Epstein's book is around his idea of, people thinking harder about
Yeah, I think
what it
is
is.
that range sitting behind my book? Because I see the color of
The
the
ranges there.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is great. I mean, very,
Did you see, by the way, that he wrote about like coronaviruses in 2007 or something?
I am not surprised. It's
Like, what a brilliant guy. Yeah, he said like it was, I mean, I think he was like sort of thinking about what Bill Gates was saying, but he was saying like this
yeah,
interaction between animals and humans. And, we know that these novel coronaviruses are popping up and it's one of the biggest threats. And this back in 2007. So I think someone, when somebody was saying like, who could have known, who could have predicted? He was like, here you go.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, what a smart guy.
I think there's some very smart people there. I think the problem with this one has just been about how specific you would need to be in your prediction to know the kind of the way that it works, the fact that you're asymptomatic, so many people don't get
Oh yeah,
ill.
I agree that that there are always going to be specific things about it that are an issue, but thinking about just the possibility of this
Yeah,
category of thing
yeah,
impacting you,
yeah,
and then saying, well, we can actually talk about this if you want,
yeah,
like as part of the thing, because it's actually pretty interesting in terms of structuring the way that you're thinking about decisions.
yes,
um, because it has to do with like you don't necessarily need to be that specific. You don't need to get the specifics right.
yeah,
Once you understand kind of what the impact, what the upside downside is, and what the possibilities for creating that downside are,
mm,
and then you can start to scrape those predictions and basically say, what are the decisions that I can make that would cover these things?
yeah,
Obviously, you want to focus on the things that are going to be higher impact, right? So I don't need to worry too much about protecting myself against the risk of uh, having my socks not match,
mm,
right? Which is obviously something that could happen. But once you sort of understand the impact of some kind of pandemic like this, whether it's a coronavirus or a new flu or something
yeah,
like that, you can start to say, okay, the impact of those are really great. So now let me think about what are the decisions that I could make now that would really reduce the impact, even though we're not going to know the specifics, right?
right,
That would really reduce the impact of that thing happening, that are relatively low cost to me,
right,
right? And that's kind of what you're thinking about, sort of classic hedging. And so as an example, like Obama created, what was it, 40 or 41 pandemic response teams that were all around the world. This
right,
is relatively cheap compared to the budget of America.
yeah,
Um, particularly compared to the national debt, right? Like, so it's relatively low cost,
Yeah.
comparatively, relatively speaking. Obviously, it wouldn't be low cost for me as a human, as a person to do it, but for a government to do it. And then have those in the areas where these things might be popping up, so that you can really get ahead of these things and sort of control it where it sits, right? So that would be one way to do it. Another way would be a strategic stockpile that's actually maintained,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So a stockpile of PPE that's maintained, a stockpile of ventilators that's maintained,
Yeah.
a stockpile of reagents, the kinds of reagents that you think you would need for testing, where you're just stockpiling those things and you're making sure that they're replenished, this kind of thing,
Yeah.
where these are all pretty low friction, they're pretty low cost.
Yeah.
You know,
Under precedents, I mean, there are smallpox stockpiles,
yeah.
So, and I think withdrawing that Obama initiative a couple of years ago seems like the stupidest thing to do in
Right, and
hindsight.
then the pandemic response
Right.
part of the NSC was discontinued, right? The National Security Council, and then obviously the stockpile wasn't maintained. So when the PPE got sent, like a lot of it was like rotting, it wasn't usable. Obviously, a lot of the ventilators were in disrepair,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Like and you can see that there really would have been a difference. I mean, for one thing, there's a direct connection between the guidance to not wear a mask for the public in America and the need for PPE for the health workers, right? So if that stockpile gets maintained, I think the guidance for Americans to wear masks starts earlier.
Yeah.
Obviously that would have a really big change. But, and this is not to be a resulter and say, oh, we should have done this. It's that these things were actually in place.
Yeah.
And it actually brings up like a really important decision-making principle, that it's not about saying, I know exactly what the future is going to be. It's, what are the possible futures? Let me think about, if those things were to occur, what's the impact of it?
Yeah.
Right. And the greater the impact, the lower the probability of the future has to be for you to do something about it. Right. So when you get to these risk of ruin scenarios, you could have a very low probability of something occurring and still want to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then basically what you do is you then look at those and you say, what are the things we could do to reduce the probability of those occurring? So like closing wet markets, right? Like that would be one answer to that kind of thing. Like, can we do something that drastically reduces the probability of this really bad thing? That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can say, across all the possible futures, both good and bad, are there decisions that we can make that actually would be good for all of them? So like as an example, and I don't know that this would make economic sense prior to this, but somebody might have looked and said, if we just in general figured out how to create a coronavirus vaccine, like there's all sorts of futures in which we never get a really bad one, but like people get common colds all the time. So maybe we could do that, and that might not be viable, but you could consider that type of decision that's actually going to work across a lot of different scenarios. Right. And then the last thing you can do is what's called hedging. And hedging, the classic example of hedging is in insurance, right? So you buy fire insurance for your house, and just in case like this really bad future occurs, it's going to have a very, very big impact on you. Very low probability that your house burns down, but really, really bad if it does. So there's three features of a hedge. One is that you have to pay for it. There's going to be a cost to it. Insurance costs money. The second is that and actually the most important, is that it mitigates the impact of a downside event occurring. Mm-hmm. So if my house burns down, it mitigates the financial impact for me on that. Yeah. But the last thing, which is actually really interesting about hedges, is that you hope you never have to use them.
Right.
Right. So classic is stocks and bonds, insurance, but having 41 pandemic response teams, maintaining PPE stockpile, maintaining ventilator stockpile, maintaining stockpiles of reagents, those kinds of things would be in the hedge category, where you're paying for something that you're hoping that you literally never have to use. Like it would be really good for all of society if you never had to go to the PPE stockpile. Wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah. Right. And I think that so this actually is a decision-making principle that you can bring out of this type of environment and start thinking about that for every single decision that you make. That stop thinking I need to be able to predict perfectly what the outcome of my decision is going to be, and instead say, let me start thinking about what all the
Yeah.
outcomes look like, start thinking about the impact of those, and let me start thinking about what decisions can I make now that will help with all that stuff.
Right.
So that's first thing is like take that out. But the second thing that's interesting and the thing about hedging, I think, is that and it's likely part of what happened with the stockpile is that as it sits there unused, people think, oh, it's so stupid for us to be spending money on this.
The waste.
Why are we
Yeah.
doing this? We have never used this. We have this big
Yeah.
stockpile of reagents. We've never used it. What a waste of money. We could use that money for something else. I have this stupid insurance, right? Like, why do I have it? My house hasn't burned down. This is so dumb.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of homeowners insurance, the mortgage company forces you to have it.
Yeah.
So you actually literally don't have a choice. But if people had a choice, they wouldn't get it. And
Right.
these are people who actually, obviously insurance is one of those things that has a cost to it. But for some people, they can't afford, like, like, so now if you allowed people to say, I can afford it if my house burns down, it's fine, I can build a new one,
Hmm.
right? Then they would not get insurance. And then people who couldn't do that would then get insurance. But what ends up happening is that you're like, when, at the end of the house, when nothing ever happened to my house.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never got in a car accident.
Right.
Nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, then people are saying, why did I have this in the first place? And then they start eliminating those actually really important hedges because they feel like they're stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. A bit of resulting going on.
A lot
I,
of resulting going on.
yeah,
A lot
I
of
won. I won. Therefore, I should have played a different way. Yeah.
right,
Well,
exactly.
yeah, absolutely. No, it's such interesting times. I think, and for me, the part of the value of having this conversation was absolutely about. I think people should start thinking harder about decision making and decision quality. And I don't think, and certainly in our industry, I don't think that's had enough emphasis. I think that
Yeah.
so as we dive into it, I'd love to kind of explore, the pharmaceutical considerations that come from giving that most of the decisions that you make are in the presence of uncertainty, which is,
Right.
it's not unknowable. It's just that much of it is unknown at the time that you step out. So,